Reggie who? Right. Yes, this is the better half of that clan. And Yolanda is a part of all that Pastor Reggie's doing, serves with him together in ministry at Recovery House of Worship, has your own clothing, jewelry. In the midst of this COVID, she took the entrepreneur idea and opened up a clothing store downtown York. And yeah, that's exciting. So I've given her some time because I want you to get to know her too, like you know Pastor Reggie. So Yolanda, it's all yours there.
Okay, I'm on. Well, first of all, I want to thank Genesis for inviting me here. Thank you, Pastor Bob. I love Pastor Bob and his wife in the Genesis Church. And every time I come here, I just feel so loved, so welcome. I usually sit way in the back, and I enjoy the worship service. So first of all, I want to thank you guys for having me here. Also, let me grab a couple of Kleenex because I can't never seem to get through my testimony without being a crying mess. But that's just the power of God, because I remember there was a time where I could not connect with my emotions at all because I was just so out of it. Something about trauma that when you've gone through so much, you just tend to stuff. And so I'm going to start from the beginning. I was born in 1974 in West Philadelphia to two teenage parents who was married, living at my father's parents' house. Shortly after I was born, my parents separated. My mother found out that my father had become an IV drug user, and she was just like, okay, either you choose me and the baby or you choose the drugs. And he put us out. So that tells you how his addiction had already had a stronghold on him. By the time I was 3, my mother had another daughter, and my grandparents appealed to her and said, okay, well, I see you're struggling. Let us take Yolanda and, move her with us. My grandparents were really hardworking people. My grandmother was a functional illiterate. She grew up on a farm, but she worked in a textile factory. And their principle, although they weren't religious people, but spare the rod, spoil the child. Like, I can't remember a Christmas that I didn't get everything on my Christmas list, but my grandfather was equally as eager to spare the rod. My father, because of his addiction, he was always in and out of the house because he was a kid himself when he had me, in and out of the house, and he would come home from his binges and it would just be chaos when my grandfather was at work. Now, although my father had an addiction, I never met a person who actually didn't like him. My father was about 5 foot tall, 130 pounds, soaking wet with 2 bricks in his pocket, but he walked like he was 7 foot tall. Like, he had so much confidence, and he had this personality and this gift of laughter that when he came into a room, he would light up the room. And so in spite of him battling his own demons and his own addiction, he just had this magnetic personality. And I was drawn to that because I spent so much time with him in a home because my grandparents were working all the time. So my mom was in and out of my life, and I remember going back and forth to visit with her. And on one of those visits, my little brother's father began touching me. I was about 4 years old at the time, and this went on for a number of years before I finally said something. And even though I said something, nothing really happened. But like, I'm at this house and I'm in this place, and by the time I'm 10 years old, I'm going through all this stuff with the beatings and the abuse and being touched, and my father in and out, and my mother in and out, and like, I started rebelling, I started acting out. I was really depressed at the time, but it just showed up in anger. It showed up as defiance. It showed up as me I was just all over the place. And I remember getting to a place at 10 years old, me and my god brother started going to church. Now, mind you, my grandparents went to church like my whole, like twice I can ever remember. And my father, he was a Muslim. And so me and my god brother, who was a couple of years older than me, we just started going to church. And it was a Roman Catholic church, and they weren't speaking English. And I remember sitting there like, okay, what was going on here? But I would go back Sunday after Sunday after Sunday until they told me they didn't have a children's choir. So my church career was done at that point. And so by the time I turned 13 and I was in the 7th grade, like I had always excelled in school and I had always been in all these gifted classes. And I remember that year I had scored 97% higher in math than all of the rest of the children in the Philadelphia school system. So I was in these classrooms and I was excelling, but my home life was a mess. And I remember at 13, the crack epidemic hit West Philadelphia really, really hard. And families who were middle class, working families began to fall off and become addicts to this substance. And my father migrated along with it. And I remember I started smoking marijuana that year because I just felt like I needed something just a little bit more. And I remember I began using with my father, thinking that if I got him to smoke pot, then he wouldn't do heroin and that he wouldn't do crack, right? So in my young beliefs, I'm thinking that I'm actually helping him, and he didn't have the wherewithal to tell me that maybe we shouldn't be doing this. So now I'm 13, I'm really on this road to addiction. I'm in and out of the streets. I caught my first criminal case doing stuff that I had no business doing. And by the time I was 16 years old, I was pregnant because I started looking towards the streets and towards men, boys, and other things outside of myself to make myself feel better about my esteem and low self-worth. But what I didn't realize what it was spiritual brokenness. But I had no concept of what the spirit was. So I went back to church at 16. It was on an Easter Sunday. I got saved. I confessed with my mouth. I really didn't believe in my heart. But I just knew that there was something more. It had to be something more than what I was going through. There had to be something more than the depression that I was feeling in my bedroom. So by the time I had my first son, not even a year later, my grandmother died and I was on my own. I was living in a 4-bedroom house in West Philadelphia in the throes of an addiction with an infant at 16 years old. Had no real life skills. I dropped out of school in the 9th grade and my disease just took off. It just took off. By 18, I was on the streets of Philadelphia with 3 children now, in the midst of a snowstorm, near Christmas, trying to figure out, how did I get here? I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know that I suffered from substance abuse. So about maybe a year later, I was walking. I was high off of marijuana, and I was walking past this church, and the spirit was drawing me. Some lady was singing, and her worship was going up. And so I went into the church, and I felt hopeful, like my heart was open to receive whatever God had for me at that time. But I remember the same lady whose worship drew me in the church, she smelt the marijuana on me and began to pray against me and came up to me in the church and hit my head and asked me to leave. Whew. And I remember leaving and I'm saying, wow, if this is what this God is about that you're saying, what is this? And so I left, and after that, my addiction just got worse. If anybody knows about addiction is progressive in nature. So I began doing the harder things. I migrated to cocaine, and my children eventually got taken from me. I began committing crimes and going to jail, and my father and I really enabled others. Seeing when I was doing okay, he was doing bad. When he was doing bad, I was doing okay. In about 2002, I got out of prison after doing a 2-year stint upstate. And I was like, okay, I'm going to do something different this time. So I started going to recovery meetings, and I started going back. I figured I just kept getting drawn to church. So I visit this church, and I used to love to hear the they tried to make it seem like I was having the spirit one day. Like it was like forcing me to shake and gyrate. And I was just like, okay, that's spooky. I'm not going back there again, right? So I leave church again and I'm on this road, but I'm changing, I'm maturing, I'm growing. And my father gets out of his prison sentence and he's sick. And when he's sick and he dies, not even a good 6 months later, I'm really left by myself. Like I have nobody, and I was forced to do something different. So I began reaching out to people. I thank God for mentors, because there were some women who were mentoring me during this process. I had got my children back, and they had started teaching me how to be a good mother to my children, and they had started teaching me about how to not run every time the going got hard. But I got into a relationship, and because I still had no real spiritual foundation, because I didn't know how to rely on God, I had been fending for myself for so long that when the relationship got rough, I went back to what I knew, and I went back to using drugs, and this time it nearly killed me. I had people put guns about 2 or 3 times within a 9-month period of time. Someone tried to strangle me to death. It just got really, really bad. And I remember thinking that my mother was going to find me somewhere in a back alley. But God, I remember getting locked up during that period, and I read a book. And in this book, it described this church. And I remember saying to myself, well, if I found a church like the one that is described in the book, like I might be okay. Like I might be able to find who God really is in my life. And I remember getting out of jail, and I had to go, I went to a whole nother town. I went into treatment for substance abuse, and I went to this town. And when I went to this town, I visited this church, and I swear, this is how God works. The church was exactly the way it was. And God, we need to give God some praise for that, right? Because I believe God does everything with divine wisdom. And I remember showing up that day, and everybody had on black, and I was dressed in black, and I was like, okay, I kind of fit in. And the next week I wore white, and everybody had on white. I was like, okay, this is where I'm supposed to be. And I remember hearing the word come forth and hearing them preach word and being in worship, and I received the Spirit for the first time in my life. Jesus. And I remember when I was overcome with the Spirit of God, in that moment, all my had been wiped away. All my burdens had been lifted off of my back. All the abuse, all the things and the bad decisions that I had made in my life in one fell swoop. I swear I must have been at the altar every Sunday for like the first year of my Christian walk. I rededicated my life to God. I professed with my mouth. I believed that God was going to do a thing in my life like he had never done before. And I'm telling you, I've been obedient to what God has had for me. My life has not been the same. School, I was able to graduate, from college. I never thought that was obtainable for me. And at the time that I was able to turn my life over to Christ, my sons were in this phase where if I hadn't have changed my life at the time that I did, they would have been statistics. So not only was I able to break the generational curse of addiction in my life, I was able to break the generational curse of addiction in my children's life. Children and my sons aren't looking at how to maneuver in the streets. My sons are talking about how to start their businesses because they saw what their mother came from, and they saw their mother walk into entrepreneurship. They saw their mother talk about God and the goodness of God. Listen, my grandchildren will never see me in a state of active addiction. My grandchildren love on me so hard, and I am just so grateful for what God has done for us and has done through me and my husband at the Recovery House of Worship, where we minister to other individuals and families who are affected by addiction, because I understand the stronghold of addiction, and I understand that if I do not do daily spiritual maintenance, the enemy will come in like a flood and take me right back to where I came from. Jesus, hallelujah. I am so grateful. I am so grateful that I get to be the girl who came from the shadows, who came from the gutter, to be an outstanding member and a productive member of my society that other women and young women look up to. There is no yokes that Jesus can't break. There is nothing that God can't do. But you said it well. You have to have faith that he will do these things. And not only did I have to have faith that he would do these things, I had to walk in my faith. Right? Because it's easy to say, oh, you got to have faith and you got to trust and you got to believe. Okay, but what does that look like? That looks like doing the right thing no matter what. That looks like putting one foot in front of the other, even when I get tired, even when I get weary. That means doing the right thing for the right reason, because it's the right thing to do. My feelings aren't facts. My feelings aren't facts. God honors my obedience to what he has called me to do. So if there is someone in here today whose heart is pricked because you know God is calling you to do something, but for whatever reason you haven't been able to get out of your own way to do it, I promise you, just put one foot in front of the other, no matter how it feels, and God will meet you at that place. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Yolanda, we love Yolanda and Reggie. Sue and I love to hang out with them, and I'm glad you got to meet Yolanda now, and now you know both of them and could put these two faces together as husband and wife, and I'm excited what God is doing through Recovery House of Worship. I want